Now let's take a closer look at the stories in Behind the Headlines. The Washington Post reports on Taliban fighters who've captured the 11th Afghan provincial capital after days of sweeping gains. 4 people have died in Italy as devastating wildfires burn right across the south of the country. That's as reported by the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. Meanwhile, Sicily records Europe's highest ever temperature, 48.8 degrees Celsius. The German authorities have asked more than 8,000 people to get a repeat of their COVID-19 vaccination after a nurse is suspected of injecting saline instead of vaccine many times over. De Pressa newspaper carries that particular story. And Google employees could see their pay cut if they switch to working from home permanently in the wake of the pandemic. The British newspaper The Guardian has more on that particular story. Well, my reviewers today are the French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani and the author and broadcaster Gavin Esler. Nabila and Gavin, you're welcome to the programme this evening. Nabila, let's just start with this simply extraordinary pace of change we're seeing in Afghanistan. And it would seem that the Taliban were ready for this moment when Joe Biden said, "That's it, we're off."
Yes, absolutely. And this really is a dreadful story in so many ways. And it's not just about strategic or military failure, but about a colossal failure for humanity. A major war has been raging in Afghanistan, a country that is almost 3 times the size of the UK, for 2 entire decades. And that war seems to have achieved absolutely nothing. And worse, it has undoubtedly radicalized huge numbers who are now joining the Taliban to wreak further havoc across the country. And the Taliban are clearly full of confidence. They are very well armed, and they are likely to capture Kabul within 3 months, according to analysts. But the principal reason for all this is the exit of American and British forces, and knowing how weak their allies are in Afghanistan. And I would bet it will take far less than 3 months for Kabul to fall, in fact. I think it seemed so easy for George Bush to start the so-called war on terror back in 2001, but no thought was ever given to how it might end. And, yes, there is an argument that groups like Al-Qaeda were prevented from using Afghanistan as a terrorist base. But again, I would maintain that there are plenty of newly radicalized young men now taking their place.
Gavin, President Biden says, they got the kit, they've had millions of dollars of training. Why do you think they're not fighting?
Well, let's imagine the world as seen by Joe Biden. He knows that next month, September 2021, is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. He knows that after all this money, material, and loss of life from the American point of view has gone on, nation building hasn't worked in Afghanistan. It has simply not functioned. And if he doesn't pull out now, when should he pull out? When would the war be over? In 25 years, in 30 years, in 40 years? So he has inherited a real problem, and he's obviously trying to do at the beginning of his presidency what he can to minimize it from an American standpoint. That does not minimize it, of course, from an Afghan standpoint. And in fact, tonight, I'm told that about 600 British troops are going back into Afghanistan to try to bring out the 4,000 British citizens who are there. So it's a mess, but when thinking about this, you have to think that in the 19th century, the Afghans saw off the British. In the 20th century, they saw off the Russians. In the 21st century, they've seen off the Americans, it would appear. And I quite often think of a famous statement by Gandhi when Lord Mountbatten said, "But India will be a mess when we pull out." And Gandhi said, "Well, it's our mess." And this, unfortunately, is Afghanistan's mess. And the West has not done much or enough to ameliorate that.
And Nabila, for the American lives that were lost, for the British lives that were lost, for the NATO forces from a multitude of nations who've served in Afghanistan and tried to build that new nation, and many of them died there, did they die in vain?
Well, I would argue that a huge weakness in Western foreign policy over past decades has been underestimating how all-out war does not solve problems. It just it makes people even more determined and indeed desperate to resist. And American President Joe Biden barely seems to know what day it is nowadays, and it's typical of him that he's just cynically insisting that there will be no change in policy. And one particularly horrendous decision by Biden in recent days has been to send B-52s to bomb provincial capitals that have been captured by the Taliban. Hundreds of civilians will have been killed in the raids, and essential infrastructures such as health, clinics, and indeed schools will have been destroyed. And this is America at its worst. But beyond the slaughter of those who are trying to stand up to the Taliban, I really fear for the country's women who we all know are treated abominably by the Taliban.
Well, it's a topic we will be talking about, I'm sure, on this programme and others very soon, because the story is far from over there. In fact, it's moving as we speak. But let's turn to the Mediterranean, shall we? Gavin, take us to Italy now. This extraordinary record temperature, yet I think to be fully agreed that it was a record. But nevertheless, it serves as an indication, doesn't it? If we wanted a practical demonstration of climate change, this perhaps is it.
Yes, we used to say in Britain about in the mines, you had a canary in the coal mine, which warned you if things were going to go wrong. Well, how many canaries have we had in these various examples of global warming? We've had in the past week the fires in Turkey, in Greece, in Italy, in Croatia. We've seen the fires in California still going on. In fact, you can track them on the internet. I was doing that the other day. We've seen the floods in Germany and Belgium. And elsewhere, and also in Turkey, as you were reporting slightly earlier, and in Australia last year. So the big picture appears to be scientists saying that the Gulf Stream, for example, its flow has been interrupted. The jet stream is moving differently from the way it has done in the past. COP26 is taking place in Glasgow in November this year. And, you know, I'm one of those optimists who think that there are human solutions to what is a clearly human problem, that we shouldn't give up, we can do things. But the British government, which is the host for COP26, has hardly covered itself in glory. Alok Sharma, who is the climate minister, who'll be kind of in charge of many of the proceedings, has taken 30 flights to go and see for himself problems in Nepal, in India, and he's been in San Jose, Costa Rica. He doesn't need to go. He could actually, you know, watch TV, phone people up, use Zoom like the rest of us. So, you know, governments have got to get together, and the British, in my view, have got to get their act together to show some leadership in Glasgow in November this year.
And if they do get their act together, Nabila, do you think the rest of the world are in a mood to listen and perhaps put money in the pot to try and ameliorate some of the challenges of climate change?
Well, they certainly have to acknowledge that, you know, as we've all been becoming far more aware about the perils of global warming in recent years, it really is one of the biggest stories, if not the biggest story of our age. But the amount of fires that are breaking out right now still comes as a terrifying surprise. And everywhere, from Algeria and America to Greece and Italy, is being ravaged by these infernos. And the situation is undoubtedly getting worse. Now we have, as you said, temperatures of almost 50 degrees Celsius in Sicily alone, and a death toll from fires that is growing all the time. And forecasters are suggesting that these temperatures will grow even higher in the years ahead, and that the kind of forest fires that are devastating the world will become more commonplace. So I was looking at some of the fires in Algeria today, and I saw that many of the dead and our rescuers, such as soldiers who have been trying to protect life and indeed property, and it is absolutely devastating to think that those young people do everything they can to fight the fires and end up sacrificing their own lives. So I think that there is no doubt at all that the technology to deal with rampaging fires still doesn't exist, but we can do something about global warming, and we should do something about global warming and industrialization. And and all the
Sorry,
dangers.
Gavin, you will have heard the arguments, I'm sure, expressed, and I've heard them expressed in the United Kingdom. I'm sure there are people extolling these opinions elsewhere too, that, look, we should really be focusing on other countries. It's not now the Western affluent nations that are necessarily the maximum polluters. They point an accusatory finger at China or perhaps India and say they need to clean their act first. They should go first. Does that argument further cause problems for this?
It certainly does. I mean, we in the West, in the rich West, have profited from the extraction of minerals and fuel for years and decades. And so it's somewhat difficult to make the moral argument that it must be the Chinese or the Indians who should bear the brunt of this. It is true, however, that they are in many ways the biggest problem. So the question is, how do we ameliorate this? Because if the pandemic has shown that we're all in it together, we're all connected in various ways, this has certainly shown that we're all in it together. And what China does and what India does is going to be really important. So it seems to me the question is, how do you get them on board? And not to say, you've got to do it because we're not going to do it. Everybody's got to do it. And everybody, that means the rich countries too.
Nabila, we've talked about the COVID pandemic. Let's take that story. And this extraordinary tale from Germany about a nurse, a one-woman protest, I suppose, that she didn't believe in the vaccine or she didn't think it was necessary, so she was injecting patients with saline solution instead. But hers is just one protest. There are still people around the world who don't believe in vaccines, aren't there?
Yes, absolutely. And that's very important to highlight, how many vaccine skeptics there still are across the world. And national health services are a very good thing, and they protect millions and they also save lives. But sadly, things are always going to go wrong. And in this case, a nurse in Germany managed to inject saline into thousands of arms rather than the coronavirus inoculation that patients thought they were getting. And there is an element of farce, dare I say, in this, but at least saline is just a harmless salt solution rather than anything that might actually be dangerous for people. And police are investigating the nurse's actions nonetheless. And I suppose the real danger in this case is that lots of potentially vulnerable people were wandering around thinking that they were vaccinated against COVID. In fact, they were not. And if you are over 70 with a health condition, as I understand many of these patients were, then the last thing you want is to walk about thinking that you're safe from COVID when in fact you're nothing of the sort.
And it's not just Germany. This is a worldwide problem, isn't it? We were reporting today on Russia. Still has got very low vaccine take-up. People are quite suspicious about it. And Gavin, the United States hasn't done particularly well, has it? Even that sophisticated nation.
No, indeed. I mean, there's two parts to this, it seems to me. One is that a nurse or a doctor or anyone can have their reservations about a vaccine or any kind of treatment and can say, as a matter of conscience, I'm not going to give it. What they can't do is dupe 8,000 patients into believing they've had a treatment when they haven't. I mean, that undoubtedly is a criminal offence. There's no question of that. So that's one part of it. And the other part of it is that the anti-vaxxers have been really quite an odd lot. I mean, the last couple of days, there was a group of them who believed they stormed BBC headquarters in London. They went to a building that the BBC abandoned, because I used to work there, I think in 2014 or 2013. They're not the most clear people, in many ways, although they believe very strongly what they believe. But there seems to be very little basis for it in science or anything else, common sense.
Nabila, take us to our final story, which is this idea of, well, it's part of the working from home debate and whether you get back to the office, really. Here's an idea from Google. I think it's not quite confirmed just yet, but the suggestion is, all right, if you want to work from home, we're going to pay you less. Now, does that seem fair to you?
Yes, I guess there is a logical argument that you save a lot of time and money if you can work from home. And this is an example of one of the huge tech companies saying it loud and clear, effectively. And it's actually the tech companies like Google who have made home working so efficient and easy. So it's unsurprising that they should be encouraging these pay cuts. And the idea is that Google employees could see their pay cut if they switched to working from home permanently, in the wake of the pandemic. So it's an experiment taking place across the Silicon Valley, which often sets trends for other large employers. And the sliding scale calculation is not just based on whether you're at home or in the office. You could get paid less if you choose to work in a poor neighborhood, for example.
Gavin, things seem to be moving in this debate. At one point, we had particularly the tech companies leading the way by saying, actually, you can work from home forever. And now they seem to be saying, well, hang on a minute. Maybe we're having second thoughts about this, and we do need some kind of interaction as a team of people in the office.
Yes, I mean, I see a lot of merit in the second part of that argument, actually. That I was talking to somebody in financial services a couple of days ago who was saying, you can't really do this job unless you connect with your co-workers and so on, and also your clients. You have to meet people face to face. It's not the same on Zoom. And I think there's a lot of merit in that. And I suspect that many of us will go back to the office. I don't particularly miss working in offices, I have to say, having worked in offices quite a bit. But I can see that the positive message is, to me anyway, a lot better than the stick. And I think Google is attempting to use the stick and saying they're going to cut people's finances. It's certainly true, however, that if you're not traveling to the office every day, you are possibly, depending where you live, saving a lot of money on petrol or on train fares or whatever. But that really isn't the company's business. If the company agrees to pay you a certain amount for a certain bit of work, they should be happy with it. But you might not get promoted if you don't turn up in the office. That's the bit that strikes me as the most obvious drawback.
Yeah, there's a sort of age divide here, I think. I mean, look, I've done a bit of broadcasting from my home. You guys are broadcasting, I assume, from your homes to us right now. But, Nabila, it's actually the younger people, probably, those just starting out in a career. They're going to find it tough establishing relationships and getting good at what they do, sitting looking at a laptop screen, aren't they?
Yes, there's a good argument to be made about this aspect, absolutely. But I think it really is all part of the brave new world which is emerging out of the pandemic as people reassess how they want to live their lives. And I think that's the main argument in the wake of the pandemic as we gradually coming out of it.
Nabila and Gavin, thank you very much indeed for being part of our programme. So that's it on this edition of Behind the Headlines.